there's nobody better to help raise our consciences than Senator Douglas Roche.
Thank you, Jonathan. I knew you would give an inflated introduction. Dear friends, I want to take a moment to pay a tribute to the Yale Center for Faith and Culture, not just for this conference, but the conference you held just recently on Christian-Muslim relations, and the work that you are doing to enhance a common word, which is probably one of the most critical movements of our time, bringing Christians and Muslims together. And in that acting as an integral part of the new alliance of civilizations. So I would like to approach the subject of nuclear weapons, as we have been discussing all day, from a position that I have arrived at in my years working on this subject down in the valleys. And I felt that we were kind of in those valleys today, the interchanges, working out all the political permutations and combinations. But I'm not so sure that the problem of nuclear weapons can be solved completely in the valleys. I think we will have to go up the mountain to do it. I'm also happy to be here in Yale, this great, renowned academic institution. I myself have taught at the University of Alberta for many years. So I feel at home here. I particularly feel at home in the Yale Divinity School, because I believe that we have to bring together in our society the best of intellectual thinking with an outreach of religion. I told my classes when we would be discussing the nuclear weapons issues, that I wanted to take you up the mountain and get a view about how this problem of nuclear weapons is related and part of the historic process the human family is on now to find, implement, and achieve the human right to peace. I have a little presentation in which I've tried to condense my views. I'm going to go fairly quickly in the presentation so that maybe there'll be a little opportunity for a few minutes anyway of an exchange of views with you. At the heart of what I will be saying this afternoon is my belief that there is something developing in the world today, and it's what I call a global conscience. Now, I'm going to need Sachin here, because it was working just fine a few minutes ago. And we're going to get it back. Thanks, Sachin. He's a fast man on the computer. The global conscience that I speak of is a new, more than an awakening of consciousness about the world, which we all know from globalization. It's an outward directed sense of responsibility We are well aware of personal conscience, which has guided humanity through the eons. Now, in the age of globalization, something is happening that is lifting up humanity to a more vibrant expression of our concern for one another, not just in our own family and in our own immediate neighborhood and community, important as that is, but because of the new understanding of human rights that has been brought into the world in the past 50 years. It is elevating us to a new appreciation for the people of the planet, irrespective of their own economic, social, racial backgrounds. And it is that global conscience. Of course, we're still dealing with the wars of our time. I'm not here to give a panacea, a quick fix solution. We are part of a historical drive and uplift and maturation of humanity that is taking place, and it is leading us to the human right to peace. Unfortunately, we still live in a culture of war. We're surrounded by war. Entertainment. We pay for violence, to see violence. The culture of war has infected our thinking and driven our processes. But we want to change that to the culture of peace, as the United Nations has helped us to try to understand. It got interrupted by the 9/11 process, which has deflected us for the better part of a decade. But we have been in a process of building the understanding of a culture of peace, and I will come to that. And the main way in which we move from a culture of war to a culture of peace is by changing our attitude. We must enlarge the horizons of our thinking. We're driven by the perpetuation and continuation of war. Of all the millions of pictures of war in the world, I've chosen this one as the only picture of war that I will show you in this presentation, because for me it's so universal. We talked about universality this morning. This is universality. Look at his wedding ring. What does it represent? Family, children, spouse, one slain soldier. Speaking so eloquently in this photograph of the futility of war and how war leads to despair and defeat. We must overcome it. In order to overcome it, we have to get rid of the worst of the weapons, the weapon which itself transcends all other weapons, the atomic bomb, nuclear weapons, devastation completely. Jonathan read a little passage this morning about what nuclear weapons do. Not only for the present generation, but perhaps even a crime even worse than the decimation of present generations, the denial of future generations of their life. And so we should learn from the Habakkuk warning. The people who are survivors of the bombing of Hiroshima and Japan are now near the end of their lives. No one else should ever suffer as we did. This is an appeal to the highest of our thinking, of our morality. This conference is called Vulnerable. Are we vulnerable? Are we vulnerable in this world? Well, I would say that we are certainly vulnerable when half the world's population lives in a nuclear weapons state. It's hard to believe. 3 billion people or so live in a state that has nuclear weapons. We have a long way to go. Now, the operational nuclear weapons, of course, mostly possessed by Russia and the United States, with the other states of Britain, France, and China, now Israel, India, and Pakistan, thrown into the mix. This is what we now are facing in trying to relieve the world of the threat of Armageddon. Kofi Annan, a man whom I could not say enough good about, just before he left office issued his warning that in respect of nuclear weapons, humanity is sleepwalking towards disaster. Mohammed al-Baradei, also a winner of the Nobel Peace Prize, if we hope to escape self-destruction, then nuclear weapons should have no place in our collective conscience and no role in our security. Notice the language that al-Baradei is using. The winner of the Nobel Peace Prize, the Director General of the International Atomic Energy Agency, a man immersed in secular activity. Yet he's using language that has the best of religion in it, but connecting to secularity. You will hear me saying today that this is the way I think religion has to speak. Our good friend this morning, Sergio Duarte, who was representative of Brazil, and it was Brazil that said at the United Nations, in summarizing the problem, one cannot worship at the altar of nuclear weapons and raise heresy charges against those who want to join the sect. So if these nations that have arrogated unto themselves the so-called right to have nuclear weapons are going to maintain that, how are they going to say with any credibility that the other states, you cannot have nuclear weapons? A two-class world in which some states have nuclear weapons and others are forbidden to get them is not sustainable. And so this has to be addressed. Rotblat, Sir Joseph Rotblat, the founder of the Pugwash movement, one of the great heroic figures of the 20th century. Jonathan talked about the 20th century. This man was one of the giants. He turned his back on nuclear weapons as a nuclear physicist. Morality is at the core of the nuclear issue. Are we going to base our world on a culture of peace or on a culture of violence? Nuclear weapons are fundamentally immoral. Their action is indiscriminate. Doesn't that say it all? And it says it in ways that are pragmatic, that reach out to any thinking person, no matter what religion, if any, he speaks of. But it also comes out of what I would call the essence of moral thinking. Here again, we see a perfect example of using language that connects with Main Street. Judge Weramantry, one of the great judges of the International Court of Justice, the use of nuclear weapons, he said, are illegal in any circumstances whatsoever. I commend to you his statement when the International Court of Justice gave its opinion in 1996 on nuclear weapons. He has about a 56-page statement in there, in which is the finest statement that I think is obtainable anywhere on why nuclear weapons are not only illegal and immoral, but why they are an insult to the thinking of any rational human being in the world. So we have the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which is supposed to get rid of the nuclear weapons. It was a big bargain through Article 6, that the states would pursue negotiations in good faith to nuclear disarmament. And the International Court of Justice buttressed that in their opinion in 1996, which they said the states must not only pursue, but must conclude negotiations. And so, from my perspective, the nuclear weapon states are clearly in violation of a law which they themselves have signed in the Non-Proliferation Treaty, by refusing to enter into comprehensive negotiations for the elimination of nuclear weapons, and thus they must be prodded on. The whole question of how to make them act is, of course, at the heart of our discussions here. Well, we're helped along the way by these four famous men, Shultz, Nunn, Perry, and Kissinger, all of whom held very high positions in the government of the United States, who on two occasions now, in 2007 and 2008, have said, we endorse a world free of nuclear weapons. So what they have done, as if it needed, they have legitimized the aspirations of nuclear weapons abolitionists by these four very highly regarded pragmatists of government saying, yes, the goal of a nuclear weapons-free world is not just something aspirational, but something which must be achieved. And of course, in their statements, they list a lengthy list of things that have to be done, centering on the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty. Now, we're just going to go up a little bit higher now on the mountain to see how all this relates to the world in which we live. I want you to look at some spending in the world. Here is the spending on military, $1.3 trillion spent by all states last year on the military. This is what the United States spent, 547. This does not include the expenditures for the prosecution of the Iraq and Afghanistan wars, which would send the figure even higher. But even on so-called regular spending, 1/2 of the total is spent by the United States. There's Russia, down pretty far, and all these rogue states that we're supposed to be so afraid of spend around $15 billion. So you can see there the disproportionate spending. Now, one way of looking at it, and I, as a Canadian, I must say, I always come here with a certain amount of trepidation, lest my audiences in this country think that there is in me some sort of inherent anti-Americanism. That's the farthest thing from the case. I lived in the United States for 8 years of my life. 3 of my children were born here. And I would say those 8 years were extremely happy years. And I had the kind of job in which, as a journalist, in which I traveled around the country. I've been in all 50 states. I feel I know the American people, and this is a great people. The problem is the political culture that has driven Washington of late. I'll say no more. I believe when we look at it in terms of what the United States could do for humanity, other than, as it has done in so many instances, by recognizing that it is not military spending that is going to bring peace to the world. It is a way in which we can find ourselves into a culture of peace from a culture of war. Here's the same spending again, $1.3 trillion on the left. And here is the Millennium Goals that we hear so much about. The 8 goals for the year 2015 to elevate humanity. Kofi Annan did so much to get them going. So they pledged $50 billion, and Ban Ki-moon said the other day that we were halfway there from 2000 to 2015. He said, well, we've got a long way to go, and he speaks it very gently. We've got a long way to go to even get anywhere near the $50 billion for the Millennium Goals. The New York Board of Education spends just about the same amount of money as the whole of the United Nations system does. I have to say, and here I will allow myself, I hope it'll be my only outburst of hyperbole this afternoon, because this is a serious audience, and I feel great responsibility being here this afternoon. This is an outrage that the United Nations, this body that has 32 specialized agencies, it would take me the whole hour of my lecture just to enumerate all the things the United Nations does that never get into the media and so on. I mean, I'm well aware of the weaknesses of the UN. My friends, the United Nations is the only thing we have right now. We better not lose it. So the fact that they get $12 billion and War Machine gets 1.3. So the human deficit, I think, is pretty well known here at this audience. 2.7 billion living on less than $2 a day. 1.1 billion lack safe drinking water. 800 million hungry. 40 million HIV infected, 30 million refugees. I mean, there is an agenda of human security issues that needs to be addressed. The Millennium Development Goals, while they wouldn't do everything, certainly go a long way to addressing that agenda. And yet look how hard it is to get money for it. So we're now facing the global trends that are so demonstrable for us. Pollution, humanity. Jonathan just talked about India, where I've been many times, and other countries around the developing world, and that kind of scene I've walked through countless times. I mean, the sheer crush, not just of daily living, of hourly living, of how to get by the next hour, in the kind of circumstances that people have been subjected to. I mean, it's overwhelming. And when I first saw it as a young man, I have to say it changed my life. When I first read into these scenes, I could talk for a long time on them. Debt, what it's done. Water. Still today, can you imagine, in the kind of world that we live in today, every fifth person does not have access to water at all. They have to really go some distance to even get it when they can. And 2/5 do not have access to adequate sanitation. It's unbelievable that the world tolerates this as a trend line. So the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists keeps this famous clock saying about how critical everything is. For a long time there, they had it at 7 minutes to midnight. A year ago, they changed it to 5 minutes to midnight in recognition of the increasing dangers of the past couple of years. And so along came Stephen Hawking, the great British physicist, who said, "We foresee great perils if governments and society do not take any action now to render nuclear weapons obsolete and prevent further climate change." And so there it is. There's the agenda for the 21st century. Climate change, nuclear weapons. The two paramount issues, and both of them are at their heart ethical issues about how we are treating one another as human beings and how we are treating the planet. What could be more spiritual or religious than that subject? Just a little bit thrown in here now about the effects of pollution, climate changes. Jeffrey Sachs says small climate changes can cause wars, topple governments, and crush economies. Darfur, among all the other things, Darfur is a reflection of. It's a reflection of climate change, the inability of water, and so on, and the shortage of resources that produced the fighting. The U.S. Military Advisory Board says climate change acts as a threat multiplier for instability in some of the most volatile regions of the world. So if we want to start heading off the wars of the future, brought about by the effects of climate change and resource depletion, then I think we need to address our minds in a very substantive manner, not peripheral, to what needs to be done to save the climate. So we're now going a little higher up the mountain now. The United Nations, for the last 20 years, has been studying the subject of the relationship of disarmament and development. And here they've said the absence of war and military conflicts among states does not in itself ensure international peace and security. The non-military sources of instability in the economic, social, humanitarian, and ecological fields have become threats to international peace and security. So there now is coming into focus the integrated agenda. By an integrated agenda, talking to a meeting or a conference that is fundamentally concerning nuclear weapons, you see now how I'm building in nuclear weapons into a wider agenda of human security issues, disarmament, development, environmental protection, and the advancement of human rights. All of them have to be pursued in order for us to raise our thinking to be able to cope with the gravity of the nuclear weapons issue by itself. There's the 21st century agenda that has now been so well identified: abolition of nuclear weapons, mitigate climate change, poverty alleviation, global health, and the alliance of civilizations, of which I will say a word in a moment. So as religious-based people, we need to think about what it is about God's planet that we need to be aware of in order to address the problems of human beings, extensions of God's love on this world. And so there is the agenda. I don't see how this agenda can be divorced from religious concern. So in global conscience, a lot of people are now looking at this whole question of starvation in the world and saying, why? A lot of people are looking at the whole question of pollution. And when we have alternate energy sources that are non-polluting, they're saying, why are we tolerating it? A lot of people are now saying, well, we have the United Nations and the prospect of annihilation of nuclear weapons. Why are we tolerating this? The very asking of this question, why, is, I think, the first time that humanity has raised itself up consciousness about the problems of the world, and that is an element of finding an expression of human conscience. Well, here is a figure, of course, that led the way in developing a culture of peace in the world. Who of us would not revere Gandhi? Johnson mentioned India. I've been several times. I've been in India twice this year. And it's hard to find adherents to Gandhi today in India. They're there, but not as before. Yet this man brought together the aspects of nonviolence, as a route to human security issues. Dalai Lama, Mother Teresa, Nelson Mandela, each one of these figures, I could talk for a long time, and Martin Luther King, all of them have taught us nonviolence. They have taught us the vision for peace that UNESCO articulated as they began to study 20 years ago what would be a culture of peace. They tried to enumerate the aspects of the culture of war that we deal with. And there you see them: enemy images, arms and armies, authoritarian governance, secrecy and propaganda, violence, male domination, education for war, exploitation of the weak, environmental exploitation. And so they contrasted it with elements that would include understanding and tolerance, disarmament, democratic participation, free flow of information, respect for human rights, male-female equity, education for peace, equitable development, sustainable development. There's the items, if you will, of a culture of peace contrasting to a culture of war. Actually, a lot of work has been done, not just to develop this intellectually as an agenda, but to implement it in programs. Again, the agenda was overtaken by 9/11. But the Nobel laureates met in the year 2000, and they set out some basic criteria by which we could try to measure how we could get to a culture of peace. And they said, first of all, to respect all life, to reject violence, to share with others, listen to understand, preserve the planet, rediscover solidarity. Each of these, as you might say, is sort of main points that each one could be elaborated, of course, and it is in much of the literature, as the essence of how public policy needs to be formulated with this kind of an agenda at its centerpiece. So who would be the most natural constituency to advocate such an agenda if it was not a religious constituency? So now we come to the understanding of the human right to peace. I put myself in that picture because it reminds me, even as I'm giving this presentation, there it is, the famous A-bomb dome in Hiroshima. It reminds me of the personal connection we all have to have with peace. Peace for me is not something that's sort of abstract, that's out there. It's something that I have to participate in as a human being. It is not only something that I claim as a right, but that I must exercise as a duty. And in doing this, by finding through a culture of peace is the route to the human right to peace. The human right to peace has been not just articulated, but it's found in United Nations documents as far back as 1984, in which, as a matter of fact, the documents say very clearly that human beings have a sacred right to peace. Notice the language, a sacred right to peace. How to implement it in a world that is torn by continuing wars. Are we going to have the clash of civilizations? You see, this is what our friend Samuel Huntington posed to us. Well, I think that the answer to this question, are we fated to have wars and clashes, is presented by the people who brought us the alliance of civilizations. The Prime Minister of Turkey, the Prime Minister of Spain, following the Madrid bombing of 2004, you remember, it was sort of what some call it a sequel to 9/11, hundreds of people were killed in the bombings, and these two men, to their credit, said, we are not going to respond to this bombing with more vengeance. And we are going to try to respond by getting at the roots of the problem and finding ways in which we can live together on this planet that is now so vulnerable to wars, weapons of mass destruction, and terrorism and all these other things. And as vulnerability increases, more war makes us not safer, but more vulnerable. And it's that intellectual change, changing our attitude, as the slide said a moment ago, that is so necessary. This is the work of the Alliance of Civilizations. So some great figures, Desmond Tutu, Karen Armstrong, Mohammad Khatami, the former president of Iran, and a host of others, studied for a year or two and brought out their document in which they said very clearly that we will achieve progress not by attempting to ignore or deny our differences, but by acknowledging them openly and celebrating our diversity. Isn't that a beautiful statement? I mean, I commend the whole document to you because it is so positive and forward-minded, yet rooted in reality. The Alliance of Civilizations has been formed to consider our interrelations through the prism of Christian-Muslim relations because of the exigencies of this moment that the world is passing through. But what they are saying applies to any combination of peoples that you want to mention. And it is this elevated thinking. And in January of this year, I went to their first conference. They had a first international conference in Madrid, in which they brought together about 1,000 people who are involved in the aspects of the Alliance of Civilization. People who are doing educational work, who are working with youth, who are doing work on the media to get rid of stereotyping, and working with migrants. There's four principal areas to implement the Alliance of Civilizations. I want to emphasize here today that it's another one of the shocking things of life. So few people know about the Alliance of Civilizations because the media completely ignore it. The Alliance of Civilizations is still a tender shoot, I would say. It's poked its head up above the ground. And it could be trampled on, another war, another calamity, who knows. But given time to mature, if we can avoid blowing up the place, the world, in the next 50 or 60 years, I humbly say to you that I believe the Alliance of Civilizations will come to a maturity, and it will reflect the ongoing thinking of some of those generations not yet born who will have a more intuitive understanding that the elements of a culture of peace that have been described here are the foundation for what ought to be implemented as a human right to peace. And it is in that elevated thinking we will find a way by humanity to do away with nuclear weapons. Now, I am not saying we have to wait until there's a perfect time arrives in some Sunday afternoon where everybody world plays tennis before we can get rid of nuclear weapons. I am not saying that. I am saying the urgency of the nuclear weapons situation, the urgency of this moment means we must work today to save the Non-Proliferation Treaty in the year 2010 at the next review as one practical element, but we should also work to try to achieve a nuclear weapons convention in the year 2020 as the Mayors for Peace, that now represents about 2,500 mayors around the world as a vibrant expression of politics at the grassroots level. I am saying that of course we must work in the practicalities of ridding the world of nuclear weapons, but we must have in our understanding that the total elimination of nuclear weapons is such a gigantic leap in thinking for most people that it has to come out of an elevation of their thinking about how we live in the world together. That's what the culture of peace is trying to espouse. That's why we need to have the facilities, the funding, the academic programs, the NGOs, and the religious movements working on this very aspect. When we look at the world and we look at the problem of nuclear weapons from that perspective, I think that we can see some very solid reasons for hope for the future based on what we have been able to do so far. So we got to change our attitude. Three main areas: religion, education, and civil society. All major religions teach the same. In Christianity, and everything, do to others as you would have them do to you, for this is the law and the prophets. Islam, none of you has faith until you love for your neighbor what you love for yourself. Hinduism, this is the sum of duty. Do not to others which if done to thee would cause thee pain. Judaism, what is hateful to you, do not to your fellow men. That is the entire law. All the rest is commentary. This is the beautiful expressions of the commonality, the universality of the main teaching of the best of religions. So that, of course, is what's being brought out now in the Common Word, of which Yale University certainly should take a bow for advancing the very important work of bringing together Muslims and Christians at this tense moment in history. Education, I call it a weapon for peace. Teaching encounters that draw out from people their desires for peace and provide them with nonviolent alternatives for managing conflicts, as well as the skills for critical analysis of the structural arrangements that legitimate and produce injustice and inequality. Peace education in the classroom, yes, but much beyond the classroom. Respectful as I am of the academic world, of which I'm one myself, I think that education, of course, has to be done in our whole community in much broader ways. We want a new generation with new attitudes who will develop critical thinking, appreciation of diversity, concern for justice, tolerance of uncertainty, capacity for creativity, and a world awareness. That's what we want to have our youth, to get these built into their own systems of thinking so that they themselves can react in a critical way, what I like to call a dissenting way, from the madness that perpetuates weapons of mass destruction. We must feel that we are not weak, we are empowered. Civil society has done many things. The Test Ban Treaty of 1963 came about because of the mothers. UN Conference on Women in 1995, Earth Summit of 1992, the Anti-Personnel Landmines Treaty, the International Criminal Court. These are just a few of the great achievements of the past couple of decades that have raised thinking and translated into government legislation. The 2003 anti-war protests, of course, 10 million people around the world marching. This is a manifestation that people recognize that we must not lose our power to protest. Non-violent protest against the encumbrances on our society of the political structures that want to give us more of the same, more spending for armaments, more preparations for wars, more of the culture of war. It has to be spoken against. And I long for the day when it will be cultural, not countercultural, to stand in the public square and say, we have a right to peace, and you politicians better give it to us. Some NGOs, of course, are working within the system. That's Bono, working at the summit there, and at least the meeting in Davos. More and more working outside the systems, the great social forums in Porto Alegre and so on, of people who are now in civil society movements around the world, in which they are now recognizing that they can participate. And so here's what we've had: war, poverty, environmental degradation. It's produced a despair in the world. So how to get hope? Peace, literacy, sustainability, some of the elements by which we change from a culture of war to a culture of peace. In looking at this world now, we have to do three things. We have to understand, we have to participate, and we got to communicate. Three essential acts. When I lecture, I send some of these ideas through. You here are all familiar with these basics: letters, teaching children, cultivating inner peace. I want to now take it up to just a bit higher level, to believe that you can make a difference. And now, through recognizing one of the most practical things that can be done that will capture how to implement into our public processes the elements of a culture of peace, through having a Department of Peace in our governments. A Department of Peace. We've got a defense minister or defense secretary in all the countries. We need the same for peace. Why? To provide leadership to abolish nuclear weapons, to promote justice and democratic principles, to develop nonviolent conflict resolution strategies, to encourage grassroots peace initiatives, to fund peace education programs. This is a rather more sophisticated agenda that is practical and is an agenda that can speak to political concerns. And it is an agenda that I believe that religious-based communities are fully compatible with. So there's the end. If you want peace, the Romans used to say, prepare for war. The United Nations now try to say to us, and culture of peace, that if you want peace, prepare for peace. Preparing for peace is not easy. It takes resilience to do it. When I walk in the mountains and I see a flower in the rocks growing wild, I take such hope, such heart from it, because there's that beautiful flower that survived the odds. It overcame the odds that it wouldn't live because so hostile the territory, and yet it did. So too, those of us who want to work for peace, nuclear disarmament, the human security agenda must have the same attributes. Because with global conscience, there is now a new hope for humanity. This is what I offer you. I believe it in my heart, and I think the religions of the world are perfectly poised to reach out with some commonality to speak to a world that is crying for hope based on faith. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that challenging and inspiring talk. For a response, I'd like to call on my colleague, Emily Towns, academic dean here at the Divinity School and also professor of African American Studies and Christian Ethics. Emily.
Thank you. I have the unenviable task of both following Mr. Roche, which is not an easy thing to do, and to also offer closing remarks and try and give us all enough time to ask at least one or two questions before we have to end at 3 p.m. So let me begin very quickly. One of the things that I do when I go into chapel at Marquand, as I was last night for our opening plenary, is that often a song will start to go through my head as the events are going on. Sometimes it's a song we're singing, oftentimes it's not. But last night, the song that came to mind was a song that is actually from my childhood. And it goes a little bit like this: there's no hiding place down here. There's no hiding place down here. Oh, I ran to the rock to hide my face. The rock cried out, no hiding place down here. Now, this song was originally written and performed by the original Carter family, a country music and gospel group from the 1930s whose traditional bluegrass style influenced such artists as Bob Dylan and Woody Guthrie. Mostly, I know them best as one of the groups I regularly listened to growing up in Durham and Southern Pines, North Carolina. Bluegrass music abounded among the sounds I regularly heard, and it did not seem odd to me then, nor now, that I could switch from the Tempting Temptations, Martha Reeves and the Vandellas, Beethoven, Mozart, Chopin, Big Mama Thornton, the Five Blind Boys, Thomas Dorsey, Flatt and Scruggs, and the Carter family. No hiding place down here has been used by such poets as Maya Angelou in her poem marking Bill Clinton's first inaugural, a popular episode on Babylon 5 TV series. And it has been repeated more times than I can count in sermons I heard growing up in Asbury Temple, United Methodist Church, that little church by the side of the road where everybody's somebody in Christ is the Lord, White Rock Baptist Church, and Covenant Presbyterian Church. I grew up in a world where it was clear many of us were not safe. All of us were vulnerable, and security was mostly a blanket you could only count on to ease the violence, but not stop it. So when I look at threats to us like weapons of mass destruction and nuclear annihilation, I do so somewhat hardened by the experiences of violation, violence, and constant threat from my childhood. It did make me yearn and keeps me yearning and trying to work for a world of peace, a world without nuclear weapons, a world in which we see these things as intimately tied to global poverty, all the issues swirling around health care, racial stereotyping that moves to racism, all the issues around ethnic caricaturing that moves so easily and quickly into ethnic cleansing, borders closing to some and not to others, economic woes, anxieties, and hallelujahs around the world, sexisms, homophobia, heterosexism, the list goes on and on. In other words, when I hear the question, are we safe yet, and focusing on vulnerability and security, I know, as I suspect most, if not all of us in this room know, means we walk into an immense theological, ethical, historical, political, and cultural playing field. And so it was with great delight that I heard yet another biblical imagery, because No Hiding Place Down Here, that song, draws on a number of biblical passages, mostly from the Old Testament. But the Honorable Mr. Roche went to a mountain. And God knows there's enough mountains in the Bible. But one of the things that strikes me about these mountain descriptions is that strange things almost always happen on those mountains. And the idea, I think, that he challenges us with is to build a global culture of peace. So I conflated both global consciousness and culture of peace. But a global culture of peace. And realizing, as I'm listening to him, develop that so well, and doing what we often don't do enough of in seminary classrooms is not tell you what needs to happen, but also give you a sense of how it can happen. It struck me that we cannot demand of others what we are unwilling to do of ourselves as a government or as a nation. Telling somebody to stop building and using and threatening nuclear weapons while we have built and have used nuclear weapons seems to me to be an exercise in folly and extremely disingenuous. How can we tell somebody to do something that not do something that we have already done and threaten by the very fact that we own those weapons? If we live in violation of the many treaties we sign, we must recognize that we are not the poster children for peace in this country. We have, as a nation, time and time again, not only violated national treaties, but international treaties. And we do it when it's convenient. And that is a problem, because people look at not only what we say, but what we do. And so if we, in fact, want to be the people of peace, we must not only say it, we must act it. And we will not be those people if we do not, unless we can cultivate a culture of peace. And the word here that was so special for me as I was listening was the notion of culture, because culture doesn't mean just one thing. When one talks about a culture, one is talking about the whole kit and caboodle, to use another phrase from long ago, but that whole part of our very isness. In other words, there is not one single place that we do not and should not touch if we are building this culture of peace. Because a culture is pervasive, it is deep, and it is wide. Just like it's not likely one can spin one's way to happiness, it's not very likely that we can spend our way to peace by purchasing threats of annihilation. And so we must, in fact, listen to what we say and then ask, is it that we are lining up with, is that what's lining up with what we do? In short, vengeance does not breed security, peace, or justice. And these are the things that I think we have been talking about in this day and a half, which make us understand what a culture of widening and deepening, embracing humanity into creation must be about. And that is what a culture of peace does. And so I do agree that there must be a dialogue among the religions. Actually, I'd rather have a conversation. A dialogue usually means two. A conversation usually means a cacophony. And that's probably a good thing. Buddhism, Hinduism, Taoism, Christianity, Judaism, Islam, earth-keeping religions, African-centered religions, and more. We need a world in our eye and not blinders on our heads if we are actually going to get at what it means to live with a global conscience, developing a culture of peace. So no, there is no hiding place down here, because that place is us. And if we do not open up our eyes and look out as we look in, we will, in fact, become those very people that we talk about, the ones who would do justice but simply don't. With that, let me stop, and I'd like to entertain questions. Not for me. Okay. Yes.
Yes. In the presentation that I gave an action challenge called the divestment challenge, in which we would start a movement in which our major institutions that have moral legitimacy would say, we can't on the one hand advocate saving the planet on Monday and then on Tuesday invest in companies that are planning the destruction of the planet. That this incoherence between the values that we espouse and the practices that we perform is intolerable in this moment of crisis. And I would like to hear both Senator Roche and yourself address whether this is a viable issue to take up now.
I will start, and then I will ask Mr. Roche to come up here and save me. I don't know that that there is any act or plan that is thoughtful, strategic, and smart and can be implemented is a bad idea to try. So I'm assuming that's what that plan is.
Thank you. Well, the government of Norway thinks it's a good idea because they have adopted it as a policy to start examining where all their own investments are, and removing those investments from industries that are inimical to the values that the government of Norway has espoused through the process of building peace issues, whether it's disarmament or development and so on. The second part of my answer lies in the hostility that we could expect to receive from the major powers for trying to implement such an idea. When the United Nations, there was a reference in the slide to when the United Nations tried to develop the ideas of the relationship between disarmament and development, they had a special study. And the study showed that in converting military industries to civilian industries, that the number of jobs increased because defense industry is so capital intensive and civilian industries are labor intensive, that it produced more jobs. It was much better in the practicalities for the social order. And yet, no sooner was that conference over when the document was adopted, but it was quickly dropped because of the pressures from the major states that were themselves feeling pressures from the military-industrial complex. In another emendation of this presentation, I have Dwight Eisenhower speaking in his famous speech of January 1961, just before he left the office of the presidency, in which he warned his country people against the incursions of the military-industrial complex. And I was just thinking about Eisenhower the other day when I was looking at the latest figures and saying, man must be turning over his grave, because the force today on the structures, not just the United States, but in my own country of Canada and in European countries too, the force of the military-industrial complex that wants to keep driving the engine. I showed you the figures, how high the spending is. Well, that's a lot of profit for those people. And so to implement this, Jonathan, I would say that, yes, the short answer to your question is certainly yes, we should do it, but we should do it with our eyes wide open, and it would require more than just, a quick resolution or a quick word or something. It would require penetrating studies by responsible organizations within society, of which, again, religion is certainly one. But it's one which I would say that if religious people were going to get involved in this process, they should very much work with other groups into forming a working coalition. This gentleman here.
Senator Roche and Professor Towns, I'd like to thank you for a very challenging and inspiring presentation. And I don't mean the following question to be a dissent or provocative. The utility of violence is trading at kind of an all-time low right now, so there's a moment of appeal to this. But I can remember a time in the 80s when the critique of the Clinton government was that it was not quick enough to provide armed support for forces in Bosnia, Srebrenica, et cetera. Rwanda, we're hearing arguments about Darfur now. I had an occasion during that Common Word conference to have lunch with the Grand Mufti of Bosnia, who said, "You are a very large country and you need to know that your mistakes affect us all. But you have a great capacity to do good, to rescue us all. Please don't stop trying." How does a culture of peace get its mind around how we can, as a global community or as nations, address truly bad actors doing heinous things?
Well, thank you very much. Of course, you're touching on probably the heart of the issue, how to change the thinking of the political structures that are conditioned to respond to violence, however it's perceived, in various situations. You mentioned Bosnia, and one could think of Somalia, and there's others. How to change their thinking. And I would come back again to the Alliance of Civilizations, making an appeal to be better understood in Western society, particularly. If all the places in the world the Alliance of Civilizations is weak, it's certainly here. It's fairly strong in Europe and in the Middle East and other parts of Latin America. I can see that at the conference I was at. We need to take seriously that conflict can be adequately dealt with without recourse to violence. The responsibility to protect idea that has now been taken up into the United Nations documentation at the 60th summit. They have a very strong recognition of the responsibility to protect, namely that nations have a responsibility under the United Nations Security Council to stop naked aggression against peoples by their own governments. They're very wary of the exercise of this, and of course now Iraq has clouded the thinking on this. Iraq, I don't want to go necessarily start down that avenue right now, but I mean, Iraq has set back the ability of the international community to exercise its responsibilities to vulnerable peoples. I believe that if we can sort of get by this period of history, that we will come to a recognition in which there has to be a use of force when necessary and in a way that meets the criteria of the Security Council, which is the only legal authority in the world empowered to use force under the Charter. And that has to be done in a way in which there is a much better, well, if trust is too strong a word, at least an acceptance of the interchanging realities between governments. And I think that the other point that you made is something that we need to keep in mind, namely the reduction of violence. It is occurring in the sense that there are fewer wars now than there were 15, 20 years ago. This has now been charted quite well, but that doesn't do much to alleviate the concern we have for the intensity of war and the continuing killings that are taking place in Iraq and Afghanistan now, which needs to be a continuing source of our concern as we try to elevate our thinking for the future. If you're brief, I'll try to be brief too, because I know you have to go.
I know you mentioned an initiative for a Department of Peace.
Department of Peace.
Right. So you mentioned Norway. I think maybe Great Britain also has one. Can you speak about what accomplishments those departments in those countries have made?
What I spoke about the Department of Peace, it's still in the idea form. I mean, I'm not saying that maybe a government or two in the world might have some sort of ministry or something that occupies itself with peace issues, but I'm talking about in the major powers, and certainly the NATO countries, having a dedicated ministry to the issues of peace. And I tried to show them there in that listing from UNESCO on the reduction of violence and the whole question of respect, how that plays out into policies that enhance the human condition, whether it's in daycare conditions or whatever that you want to mention. The Department of Peace idea is something that is largely is still in abstract, or it's still in the idea formulation. There is a movement called the Department of Peace idea that is working here in the United States. The U.S. There is a U.S. School of Peace and so on. That's sort of a modest replica of that idea. But in my own country, in Canada, I know that because I'm going to speak to a group that's dedicated to this very idea next week, and they are trying to put political pressure on the system to get a Department of Peace that will address the implementation of the ideas of a culture of war with the same funding and the same dedication that the Defense Ministry has for its. The final question. This man here.
Thank you so much for your speech, but I wanted to go back for a second to his previous question. What fundamental changes need to be made in the UN, which is a political organization with a bias towards non-action, when we've seen for the past 5 years they've been unwilling to intervene to stop genocide, to stop political violence? They're just a completely ineffectual body right now. What changes need to be made to make them more effective?
That's a very large subject, the reform of the United Nations, but I think in a sentence or two, the Security Council has to be made more representative of the peoples of the world. It's still representative of the formation of the world at the end of the Second World War. The idea that Europe has 3 or 4 seats on the Security Council, while Africa has none, Latin America has none, and Asia, which has half the population of the world, only has 1. All this has got to be changed. They've tried to do it, and it's bad. It's a bad situation to try to address calmly the reform of the United Nations when we're lurching from one crisis to another. And again, I would say that in this decade, we've been set back so much by the Iraq and Afghanistan terrorism situations that we've got to find our way out of it before the conditions of the world will be such that we can, without emotion and hatred and the excessive competition among states, reflect the growing reality in the world. I close on this note. And this is something that religious people, I think, should take to heart. No one problem can be solved by itself. And no one country by itself can solve all the problems. There is an interchange. This is to speak to the enlarged human condition and to speak to the relationship we have as human beings, all of one family, coming back again to universality. We have a new opportunity in the recognition of what human rights has done to improve our relations among one another, and also to raise up our thinking about who we are on this world, on this earth, and then our relationship to the world, to the planet itself. That is something that is fundamentally ethical, it's fundamentally moral. For me, it is fundamentally spiritual. I do, as a practical politician, I can tell you, I do approach these issues from a spiritual basis, that this is God's creation, and I believe that here on earth we are called to continue the development of God's creation. And we now have the tools to do this. And so it's a perfect moment. Jonathan talked in his presentation this morning about the convergence of love and spirituality with the pragmatics and practicalities. Yes, that's exactly the situation. What we've known for ages, that it was good to love one another, now we know in the age of weapons of mass destruction that if we do not do this, that is to say, if love is too strong for some people, at least a series of steps that reflect respect and cooperation, it's the basis of love. If we do not do this, practically, we are, as Kofi Annan said, sleepwalking toward disaster. I close with this appeal to the Yale Center for Faith and Culture that has done so much work in the common word to try to bring this issue stronger to the forefront, centering on nuclear weapons as the binding element for all of us. That if, no matter whether we are Christian, Muslim, Jew, Hindu, black, Protestant, rich, poor, old, young, if we lose this world by nuclear weapons, which we could, this is the greatest affront to the one God that we all are here to love and serve. Thank you very much for allowing me to come.